Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Alina Nowobilska. I'm from the Department for Research at the Pileckiego Institute. I have absolutely two fantastic guests with me. Many of you have already met our fantastic guests. So Professor Daniela Plescha, who is from SOAS University, who's published this absolutely fantastic piece of work. And obviously our commentator, which will be after Professor Plescha has his talk, is Professor Patrycji Grzebyk, who is at Warsaw University, who's also published absolutely extensively on law, humanitarian law, and pretty much everything. Her list is extensive, so I think a very appropriate person to be commenting on this talk today. But before we actually go into Professor Plescha's talk, we're going to have a bit of a snippet, which hopefully this will work, of a docu-series that he was one of the guests in. So we're going to watch a few minutes of this, and then I'm going to allow Professor Plescha to take the floor over.
That's not me.
Podczas Holokaustu zamordowano 6 milionów Żydów. Trudno sobie wyobrazić, jak wygląda 6 milionów ludzi. Mogę jedynie próbować znaleźć jakieś porównanie. Pochodzę z Yorkshire, który jest największym hrabstwem w Wielkiej Brytanii. Przejazd z północy na południe zajmuje 2 godziny, a ze wschodu na zachód 2,5 godziny. Jest tu ponad 1100 miast, miasteczek i wiosek. W sąsiadujących ze sobą miastach Leeds i Bradford mieszka prawie 1,5 miliona ludzi. Sheffield ma 600 000 mieszkańców. W sumie populacja Yorkshire liczy obecnie niespełna 5,5 miliona osób. Gdyby naziści eksterminowali całą ludność Yorkshire, co zrobiłby rząd brytyjski? W amerykańskim stanie Maryland mieszka 6 milionów ludzi. Gdyby wszyscy oni zostali zmasakrowani przez nazistów, co zrobiłby rząd amerykański? Co zrobiłby świat, gdyby prawie 6 milionów mieszkańców Danii zostało zamordowanych przez nazistów? W szkole w latach 60. ubiegłego wieku, zaledwie 35 mil stąd, mówiono nam, że Brytyjczycy nie mogliby dokonać Holokaustu. Jesteśmy cywilizowani i ponad takie rzeczy. 16 marca 1190 roku, po wielu tygodniach antysemickich zamieszek, 150 Żydów, cała żydowska populacja Yorku, zginęło lub popełniło samobójstwo w dawnym zamku, który wznosił się w tym miejscu. Gdyby mieszkało tu więcej Żydów, oni również zostaliby zamordowani. Niezależnie od rzeczywistej liczby ofiar, była to masowa eksterminacja. W 1290 roku Edward I wypędził wszystkich Żydów ze swojego królestwa. Żydzi mogli powrócić do Anglii dopiero 367 lat później, kiedy pozwolił im na to Oliver Cromwell. W ciągu ostatnich 2000 lat, w różnych epokach, w większości krajów europejskich, Żydzi byli nieustannie prześladowani. Rząd wysłał kilku z nas, kongresmenów, abyśmy zobaczyli te obozy. Jeśli ktoś jeszcze zastanawia się, czy na tej wojnie warto było walczyć, szkoda, że nam wtedy nie towarzyszyło. Na własne oczy ujrzeliśmy, czym jest faszyzm i do czego prowadzi gdziekolwiek się pojawi. W Niemczech doprowadził do powstania ponad 400 obozów, takich jak ten, który widziałam. Tego przerażającego widoku nigdy nie zapomnę. Szoku, jaki wywołuje ten widok, nie da się zapomnieć. Faktem jest jednak, że alianci publicznie i oficjalnie potępili to, co dziś nazywamy Holokaustem, a co wówczas nazywano po prostu eksterminacją Żydów. Już w czasie bitwy stalingradzkiej zimą 1942 roku. Rządy państw sojuszniczych sformułowały w Londynie pierwszy zbiór zasad dotyczących ukarania nazistów za zbrodnie wojenne. Władze sowieckie już na początku wojny publikowały szczegółowe opisy zbrodni nazistowskich, w tym pogromów, jak je nazywano. I to nie tylko w prasie, ale także w oficjalnych oświadczeniach. Aliancka deklaracja w sprawie eksterminacji Żydów odczytana została w Izbie Gmin.
So you've seen a little bit of our guest, and our guest is going to take over now.
Thanks very much for a slightly long intro. I want to show it because it is available in Poland on, I think, Polish Sky, version of Sky, and you and your networks might find it useful. It took David Wilkinson 18 years to get it produced, and as you said, for those who say the Jews control the media, I never got any Jewish funding. But it's, I think, a stunning piece of work in talking about how the Nazis got away with it, very broadly speaking. What I want to talk about is the multinational effort to stop them getting away with it and how some were brought to justice. And I talked about this a little bit this morning for some people, so hopefully I won't be too repetitive. I am going to need to pull that over and talk to it to get this machine over here. If you have devices, without dragging everything onto the floor here, I'd encourage you to look up unwcc.org because I'm going to be speaking to that, and this is a way of encouraging you perhaps to use that resource. As I said this morning earlier on, but I'll come back to, this work and this material I think is extremely valuable in helping address issues of war crimes, crimes against humanity. Today I'm involved with colleagues at SOAS and elsewhere in a project funded by Leverhulme looking at the issue which in the jargon is called complementarity. The International Criminal Court's mandate is to step in where a local, national, or again in the jargon, domestic jurisdiction doesn't work. And in theory is designed to support local jurisdictions. And although there's been some policy lists, not a lot has been done about supporting local jurisdictions. And into that discussion, the work of the 1940s has a great deal to say. And in the latter part of my remarks, I'll come back to that and the application to efforts to bring justice about Russian activities in Ukraine and also head of state immunity. And you'll find under the news and blog section of some colleagues, students we wrote who'd helped me develop this work from the conference in Berlin that I was delighted to be at. And there you can see some of our distinguished colleagues. Dominica has had great work here. Some work you'll see here from a conference we did with the University in Ireland, Maynooth, and an international group of scholars, and which you published in the international law blog Opinio Juris. So quite a lot of my remarks you can find written down here variously. And as I say, this is the burden of the latter part of what I want to talk about, but for many people this commission is still a little bit strange and odd and new. So if I can go back to the beginning, Nuremberg and subsequent proceedings and the proceedings in Tokyo tried around about 200 people. Roughly speaking, and again the stats are buried in my website here, roughly speaking, a few hundred people were tried before the international courts of the 1990s, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and so forth. The countries of Asia, and particularly of Europe, tried and convicted 10,000 Axis personnel in at least 2,000 trials by 1948 across Europe. And this in itself presents a radically different paradigm of international criminal law and its application than the Nuremberg model. And we've written for some time, myself and various colleagues, on this new paradigm. It's particularly important, I think, in conflicts in Africa and also in Ukraine, where we're talking about large numbers of crimes, low-level perpetrators, some high-level crimes, but some low-level crimes being prosecuted. And for people approaching this, it can seem very daunting. After all, Nuremberg only dealt with a few dozen, 20, 30. Oh, but here's an example that dealt with thousands. How did that work? How did that happen? Many of the political pressures that exist today about politicization of the law, about national interest getting in the way of justice, operated in the 1940s. It's a very familiar territory. Broadly, the legal experts from all the refugee governments in London combined to try to develop legal processes to bring the Nazis to account after a hopeful victory. Somewhat whistling in the wind, a bit optimistic, you might say, at the time when the Nazis were expected to win the war. Historians are allowed to go out and make wild deductions. I think that there were one minor and one huge consequence of the resulting from the Red Army victory outside Moscow in the winter of '42. The first was, I think, it accelerated the Wannsee Conference and the final solution. Goebbels said, we have 260,000 deads, the Jews will pay. But there was a certain level of panic in the Nazi hierarchy at the defeat of the Wehrmacht, and a moment when it was thought that the regime might collapse and the army might collapse in the East. At the same time, I think in London, I'm guessing now, there was perhaps a brief moment of hope which brought together, under General Sikorski's leadership, the exile governments to St James's Palace to make the declaration on punishment for war crimes. And in that declaration, and in Sikorski's speech, which is well worth a read, I think, they say, we need international legitimacy for our national legal processes after victory, which is a critical point of recognition that national sovereignty is not sufficient. There needs to be international support and legitimacy. And they're quite blunt. We don't quite know how all this will work, but we're putting down a marker now. And there were statements from the Soviet Union, but particularly from Roosevelt and Churchill in this period, which I document but tend to be overlooked around this period. And this pressure produced, eventually, there was strong opposition from within the British and American foreign ministries for a variety of reasons to a war crimes process. But by the end of '43, the exile governments had pretty much developed what they wanted to see happen through the London International Assembly. And at that point, the British government was persuaded, finally, with the Americans, that they would initiate what was called the United Nations War Crimes Commission. Obliterated from our history with Stalinist precision is the fact that the United Nations started in 1942 with a declaration by United Nations of 26 countries, and not in 1945. And 1945 was the culmination of a multilateral effort, and if you look at the documentation of the time, it was the United Nations that was fighting the war. And this was a very conscious decision by Franklin Roosevelt to avoid the debacle of the League of Nations by using the same branding for the war effort as for the peace effort. And so he would say United Nations and War and Peace was stamped on every piece of US postage. And I've written another book about that, which led me into this topic. That's why it's United Nations. Before there was a United Nations. Going back to St. James's, though the caution in Foggy Bottom and Foreign Office was such that the British and the Americans never signed on to the St. James's Declaration, although the Chinese did, which is an indication of the politically charged nature of the process. The Commission finally gets going in the winter of '43. Roosevelt appoints as ambassador a school friend of his he's already posted to Lisbon and to Hungary before Pearl Harbor, and who has a record in the 1920s of fighting off the Ku Klux Klan from taking over the Democratic Party. You know, the domestic and the international are more connected than we might realize. So he has a profound anti-racist stance. And he writes that he's going to London so that the Nazis are not able to enjoy a revival such as the Confederacy has managed in our own country, which I think is a singular piece of prescience given what has been happening more recently. The State Department stopped him going for 6 months. I document this these up and downs in my book. But finally he gets there and the exiled governments are ready with their dossiers. Not in huge numbers, there's some frustration, but by the end of the war in Europe, some hundreds of dossiers, pre-trial dossiers, have been submitted to the Commission. The exiled governments had wanted there to be a standing international tribunal already, but this was turned down. The Anglo-American foreign ministries didn't want any process, and so the compromise was a commission for investigation that would develop evidence, which would list war criminals, which would provide legal guidance on what was an appropriate legal process, all things which might think are quite familiar or useful in present circumstances. The commission beginning work and developed a draft constitution for International Criminal Court, the first draft of which was written by an Indian civil servant in pre-independence India. They developed mandates for military tribunals, which were largely used. They sought to create, as it were, an FBI to track down the Nazis, which was turned down. But some part of these processes were carried out through Eisenhower's headquarters in Crocas, which you may be familiar with, some part of those functions. And clearly there was a relationship between the governments, the Commission and Eisenhower's headquarters to try to develop these processes. They also, they started to consider the charges brought by member states. And by the end of the 1940s, to 48, when they were closed down, they had considered charges against some 36,000 Axis personnel, a huge number. And the dossiers now, thanks to the wonderful work by the archivists here, are incredibly readily accessible internally. And the crimes range from the mass slaughters of Treblinka and Auschwitz, which I shared with this morning's crew, and I won't do again now, down to relatively minor instances of crime. Housevrouws in the Netherlands were particularly concerned about the theft of their bicycles by the Nazis at the lower end of the spectrum. There is an instance in the Far East where the Hague Conventions on Cultural Crimes brought a 3-month sentence to a Japanese corporal for having cut the hair of a Sikh soldier and forced him to eat tobacco in violation of his religion. Again, interesting for those people who are looking at cultural crimes today, and everything in between were considered. The The Commission bent over backwards not to be involved in victor's justice, which is an important critique even today. And they considered what constituted a war crime, an international crime. And after some consideration, they decided that the list brought up by the Allies at Versailles, the Versailles list, was the list to use, because it had been accepted by the Germans and the Japanese had been co-signatories to it, and therefore it had international status as crimes, but they also recognized the Hague Conventions as the basis for prosecutions. And it's interesting that while the French objected to the Kellogg-Briand Pact being used as a basis to rule out the crime of aggression because it had no provision for prosecutions within the treaty, the French had no such objections to the use of the Hague Conventions, which also have no provisions for enforcement. But we'll let the French off for that. At this time, the exiled governments developed their own national war crimes policies, which we have detailed and rediscovered. So more or less these have been forgotten. So Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, all by 43, by 44, had all got national policy to use for prosecution of war crimes, partly to provide process, but also to get over the objection that it wasn't a crime at the time. By this being said, it should also be recognized that the American president at least very clearly and repeatedly said, "You will face your day in court, Nazis," in public statements, before and the Holocaust really got going and after. He was, specific and repetitive on that point. However, they run into more significant problems as they, develop the International Criminal Court proposal, which is vetoed by the Foreign Office and by the State Department, as they develop the idea of crimes against humanity. And I'm sorry, my colleague and his great fun book, East-West Street, but Crimes Against Humanity was not invented in a garden in Cambridge in a conversation between Lauterpacht and Jackson. The United Nations War Crimes Commission received a written proposal from Roosevelt's ambassador, which I can pull up here. One of the things we were quite startled about when we found this. Here it is. It is clearly understood that the words crimes against humanity refer, among others, to crimes committed against stateless persons or against any persons because of their race or religion. Such crimes are justiciable by the United Nations or their agencies as war crimes. It is a pretty comprehensive definition. Now, it's not the one we have today, but it's pretty comprehensive. And as I say, this is March of 44, and it's designed to deal with the German-on-German question, specifically. It's written partly at the behest of one of the advisors to Roosevelt, informally, Sheldon Gluck at Harvard, who was Ben Ferencz's boss before Ben went off to the army. He taught Ben a connection which is often lost. And surprisingly, there is no Sheldon Gluck building or campus at Harvard. Others are recognized, but not Sheldon Gluck. Go ask them. Go ask them why. I guess he didn't have a huge endowment to give. But nevertheless, recognition should be given to Professor Gluck at Harvard. And of course, Pell is lost to history, more or less completely, although I think he deserves its own miniseries myself. The Pell and his British counterpart, Sir Cecil Hurst, campaigned or tried to communicate with the Foreign Office immediately and with the State Department to get approval for crimes against humanity, and failed. There had some idea of publicity. Let me see if I can just... you can see him on the left. He's a publicity photograph while he's in charge of this commission, and there he is sitting in his study reading Mein Kampf. I think it's a hilarious sense of publicity for someone who's just been appointed chairman of a war crimes commission in 1944. A great image, which will add to my site. Now, for those who look at the Commission's work today and say, well, it's all far too long ago and can't influence anything today, there are a few things to be said. The first is that at least 70 cases were used by the ICTY. I document them in one of my appendices as examples of precedent and practice in the Yugoslav trials. So there we are. There is the continuity down the decades for the use of this material and these trials in the modern world. The second is, well, it was all kind of informal, really. Well, this is nonsense. It was a formally constituted diplomatic body. You know, the British had a formal command paper authorizing it, and its personnel were, you know, the elite of the European judiciaries. And it's worth saying a word or two about Sir Cecil. Apart from having a sense of publicity, as a young man, he had been part of the British Foreign Office delegation to the Hague Conventions in 1907. He became deputy head of the Foreign Office Legal Department, then head of the Foreign Office Legal Department, and then was appointed as a member of the International Permanent Court at The Hague in the 1920s, and for 3 years was president of the International Court in The Hague. Of course, it was not really functioning by the later 40s, after they had to make a rapid exit when the Nazis marched in, but it still was technically in existence. And so at the time he took on the role of chairman of the UNWCC, Sir Cecil was a long-standing architect of international law, international criminal law, and a serving member of the International Court. So his efforts with Pell and others to press for crimes against humanity is really not sufficiently recognized in any of the historiography. Now, there are distinguished Polish representatives, Mr. Glaser, others, and people, René Cassin, Trygve Lie, are also involved in these processes. And you look around the European governments in London, and each of them, it is their best lawyers who are present. So this is an elite legal body convened of states that are working out how to pursue justice. By the end of 1944, the pro-Germans and anti-Semites in London and Washington have had enough. Sir Cecil, in that wonderful British phrase, almost Stalinist, but he didn't actually die, resigns on grounds of ill health, but manages to struggle on and live till 1963. In Washington, Congressman Ambassador Pell comes home and sees the president, who tells him to get back off to, he goes to the State Department, has a chat, goes to see the president, who wishes him well and going back to London and get on with the job. He goes back to the State Department and they say, whoops, forgot to tell you, Congress has removed your line item from their budget, so you're fired. Very, very contemporary West Wing maneuver, yeah? A very House of Cards. Straight out of the miniseries. He goes nuts. because he is, one of his biographies was called A Brahmin in Revolt. His family, one of the members said, well, the title of the autobiography was, "We used to own Brooklyn." They were Northeast landowning Yankees from the 17th century, like Roosevelt, and he was having none of it. And in the New York Times archive and elsewhere, you'll find something called the Pell Affair. And in the winter of 44, he ran a lonely and I think heroic campaign to get the government to, the State Department to acknowledge the president's policy of pursuing German-on-German crime. And I document here a memo that he wrote to Truman and then publicized about how he had been undermined in London by the State Department, how they had interfered with his communications, they tried to stop him getting there, and they connived at his being sacked. In that account, there is the verbatim transcript of a conversation with the state. Today they wouldn't get away with it, I've got to say. You don't get a back and forth interaction between a journalist and a politician or a Secretary of State. But in those days they were a bit more forthright, and there's an exchange of 4 or 5 times in which a journalist says, so do you support the president's policy of German-on-German crimes being a crime? And they did yada yada, goes back several times. And then the Secretary of State goes, is it really necessary for me to be quite so precise? To which the journalist says, is it really necessary for you to continue to obfuscate? Oops, have I gone too far? Oops. Which they said, yes, they agree it. And at that point on, formally, it's agreed that this is American policy. But without that fuss, it's hard to see this element of Nuremberg going forward. We know that American officials privately were, and Roosevelt, I think, didn't want to pick a fight with his Secretary of War over this. There were other fish to fry, politically. But his Secretary of War said bluntly that we can't go around prosecuting the Nazis for hanging German Jews in Germany because of the way blacks are being hung in Alabama. This direct comparison was made, and people were aware. It wasn't, oh, well, we better clean up our act. It was, we don't want to lend ourselves liable. Jackson was appointed, but nothing happened. And again, as a historian, you have to make your own analysis, and having lived and worked in Washington for the best part of 20 years, Pell was denigrated for having kicked up a scare and nothing was needed, and Jackson was being sent to London. And I can't remember the exact date, but the newspapers ran with the story of another round of Pell's accusations, and the same day or the afternoon before, Truman finally announced what mandate Jackson had, and Jackson went to London. But without that fuss, it's hard to see, if you're analysing agency, who gets to push things along, where the agency was in Washington for Nuremberg. And when Jackson comes to London, he meets with the commission and says, well, unless we get an agreement on what became the IMT, then the Americans won't prosecute anything except for actions against American POWs. And that's in the minutes of the UNWCC. So right up to the end, highly politically contested outcome of what became the Nuremberg trials. Meanwhile, the commission is continuing to process charges. And this morning in my book, I've shared some of them. We talked about Polish charges to do with Treblinka and Auschwitz. It's worth mentioning, for example, that well-received wisdom in France is that until there was an accidental discovery of files in a French police prefecture in Paris, which are now a big deal in Paris, there was no really official understanding of what had happened at Drancy. And with that excuse, Agence France Presse refused to run the story when I gave them the documents, which showed that in July 44, the point of liberation, a dissident French police officer at Drancy, who had managed to get himself out of Drancy, presented a detailed and heart-rending dossier of everything that had gone on in Drancy, and particularly the way in which the cruelties accelerated with the advent of the well-known Alois Brunner, SS officer. So time and again you see that very early on, resistance fighters, victims, are getting data to London while the fighting is still going on, not just looking for revenge, but for justice. And I think that's again important to think about when we're looking at the contemporary situation, and that these were pursued in a large-scale manner, not by an elite bureaucracy. And again, I think the problem with, forgive me, at some point I'll have a debate with my dear friend at UCL, but this was not just a decision of a couple of elite judges and lawyers, but it needed thousands of people to bring 36,000 indictments from across Europe. It was a mass movement for justice, not an elite concern, or not merely an elite concern. And I found a Hollywood movie, indeed, envisaging a war crimes tribunal in Poland from 1944, which adds to the narrative that this is a popular culture, a popular movement, not just an elite concern. Similarly, in the Netherlands, there is an affidavit I found of a Dutch nurse who became quite a figure in post-war Netherlands, wrote a book quite controversially, I think pursued some of her persecutors, but who had ended up in Westerbork and details the transport out of Westerbork, and then in half a line says, on such and such a date I escaped from Westerbork. And then is part of the resistance, is captured, escapes, fights again, gets over the Pyrenees, gets back to London, and the day before D-Day gives an affidavit to a Dutch legal military officer at the embassy in London about what's happened. So time and time again you see people with most difficult circumstances contriving to escape and then determined to give evidence. And I think you see a similar story in the many, and you have some of them here, the many accounts of, for example, Poles conscripted into the Wehrmacht, who end up in POW camps in Scotland, and the Polish government has a whole department, as you know, involved in debriefing them. And they are very clear about, the crimes that they experienced and witnessed before conscription and after. So this comprehensive legal effort and social effort to bring justice is obliterated by this restriction to the Nuremberg model. And I think in the, I pointed out on my website, I don't want to abuse my time too much. Am I all right for time?
You're good for time.
Sir? I have time. There's a wonderful report that the Commission made to the UN in '48. In their long introduction, they say this whole process is to distinguish us from the savages, and that's why we have to take civilized legal norms seriously. Is why we have to be attentive to the rights of the accused, which is why we have to avoid accusations of victor's justice, and that the work of the Commission should be subject to the study of psychologists and anthropologists and historians and legal scholars after the war. Well, of course, this never happened. And what happened as part of the blatant attempt to rehabilitate the Germans, and as I say, I think in this documentary, you can kind of understand the realist perspective that says we need to rehabilitate judges and engineers from the Nazi system to help rebuild Germany. But quite why do you need to rehabilitate the Einsatzgruppen leaders? How do they contribute to the reconstitution of Germany? Well, the answer is that they were part of a system and their comrades were looking out for them. And they worked with their expats friends in Wisconsin who persuaded Senator McCarthy to take up their cause, who ran a brilliantly effective campaign, even to getting out of jail SS men who had demonstrably machine-gunned American prisoners. Quite a political achievement, I think. And the Commission's works were abruptly, on the initiative of American intelligence, once transferred to the UN in New York, one might say naively. Within months, the United Nations had been instructed, or its legal official, who was an American appointee, decided that these files should be classified. And they were secret even from the governments that had made the files, from the individuals who had made the files, and the regulation which existed until, hey, I turned up, was that while they were accessible, you had to have personal authorization from your member country, personal authorization from the Secretary General of the United Nations, and then you were not permitted to make any note or copy of anything that you read, which is the situation that I found in 2011. But however, we overcame that. And I think that provides a reasonable outline. I just want to come back and finish on Ukraine. In general, a model of prosecuting large numbers of perpetrators for all sorts of crimes is a very useful one when faced with large numbers of perpetrators committing all sorts of crimes. Much more useful than just a model of 24. Yeah? So that's the big picture. The smaller picture goes back to, there we are. The Czechs indict Hitler. Head of state immunity, forget about it. October 44, they indict him again. The Polish government indicts Hitler, and in February, after the discovery of Auschwitz, the Belgians indict Hitler. In September of 44, Sir Cecil Hurst presides over a meeting of the Commission which agrees unanimously to list the Axis heads of state as war criminals, awaiting national indictments. There isn't at that point, or indeed international indictments, they don't differentiate at that point. So that's a clear international judgment of 16 states, led by some of the most senior and experienced and reputable international lawyers of the time, that head of state immunity is over. They document this in the history of the United Nations War Crimes Commission, which is on my website, which is chapter 10 is devoted to this issue, and they discuss there with footnotes to the Commission's decisions how Hitler was subject to indictment by national governments. And the charges range from legalistic issues, such as the jurisdiction of the special courts, Nazi courts in Czechoslovakia being illegal. And similarly, the Poles are concerned about the legality of the Nazi courts in Poland, through to Auschwitz. So initially they address this from a very technical legal perspective, but they rapidly broaden it out. So this, to my mind, at a minimum provides a body of opinio juris evidence with respect to consideration by the International Court of Justice, which has said that there is no basis or experience for one nation to pursue another nation's head of state. And I just don't think that the ICJ is aware of this. I don't think the Belgians were aware of it, although I haven't talked to them, I haven't had the resources. The Belgians were aware of it when they pursued Sudan over Bashir. And people say, oh, well, but they never actually tried Hitler. Well, they haven't tried Bashir. It's a spurious argument that it wasn't brought to trial. These are legally approved, nationally approved, precedent state practice that heads of state and their entourage are not immune. And by the way, they took 3 months in '44 to discuss whether or not Hitler's cabinet were liable, and quite a lot of them they decided weren't liable, and they discussed this in history, which has been published for 60 odd years, because they didn't have any real executive power. They were just Hitler's puppets, and all the power lay in the head of state, and therefore attributing the same level of responsibility to his immediate entourage wasn't valid in that case. An interesting level of attention to important detail. So that is hopefully a not very rapid, a rather lengthy tour of the UN War Crimes Commission, where it came from, where it went, and some indications of why some of us, and hopefully we'll have a fruitful continuing relationship with Pilecki on this, think that we can pursue these issues in a way that has some contemporary relevance. And I hope I've managed to keep you awake in that dreaded after lunch slot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm assuming that we will have some interesting questions, but before we get to the questions, I would just like to ask Professor Grzebyk if she'd like to make a few comments.
Thank you. I'm fully aware that our main guest is Professor Plescha, so I just make a few comments, or maybe to ask further questions or doubts, because yes, the works of the United Nations War Crimes Commission, which you just described, are extremely important for us, because for people from this part of Europe, I'm talking about Polish people, Czech people, we really could observe the huge effort made from the very beginning, from the 1939, from the very first days of war, to alert world about the crimes and to start a discussion about the criminalization of the crimes. We could observe, also this is described very well, I think, in the book of Michael Fleming, when he describes that you had different tracks, to use soft diplomacy, to use Dominika in her speech, she presented many different bodies in which the discussion took place. Finally, we had the United Nations War Crimes Commission, which was established mainly because of the stubbornness of those smaller states, which were occupied and which suffered. And this is, I think, quite crucial, that if you see your own interest, you will do everything to try to punish criminals. And we can also refer to the experience from the First World War, because there was a discussion about prosecution of criminals, not only German ones, but also Turkish ones. And there was a huge discussion about crime against humanity at that time, crime against Armenians. And France, UK, they did agree to put certain provisions in the first treaty with Turkey, and the interest of UK was as long as it concerned the crimes committed against British prisoners of war. But when this question was dealt with Turkey, then the interest in prosecution of further criminals has lost. And I think that if we make this link to the situation now in Ukraine, that's why the problem of Ukraine is now how to convince the world that the problem of crimes in Ukraine, this is really a problem of other nations. Because during the World War II, it was to some extent easier because so many states suffered from crimes. Today, it's a little bit more difficult. And I have some bitter remark, because we had such I would say fruitful, so many debates. You did mention the legal issues which were discussed extensively, yeah, that we could see the huge development of criminal law. But then when we talk about the main discussion, how to judge criminals, this was discussion only among big powers, and others were excluded. And for example, from the people from our part of the world, when now there is a discussion, we need a new Nuremberg, we should ask ourselves, really? Do we really want to have another tribunal in which victim states would be excluded and only big powers would decide how to do it, how to prosecute them? So I would also love to hear your comment. Why this fruitful cooperation in UNWCC was then a little bit neglected, you know, in the final discussions, these discussions were just among the representatives of big powers, and this huge heritage of this commission was to some extent neglected. We do remember Gluck. I can tell you, for example, that he was invited to publish in Polish legal journals about the Nuremberg law, and we do also remember Pell, because Pell is mentioned in Polish publication as this person who supported the idea of the prosecution of crime against humanity, which was supported by Glasser, whom you mentioned, and also by Etcher. And we know what price he paid for this, yeah? And that even the funds for the commission were cut a little bit because of this discussion concerning crime against humanity. But I also would like to refer to the film from which we start, and this famous 6 million Jews, yeah, which we start. Do you think that this is also the problem today to talk about crimes? Because in comparison to 6 million people who vanished during the Second World War II, I'm talking only about this Jewish population. Now when we talk about 16,000 people killed in Ukraine, it doesn't seem so serious. And maybe this is the problem, to trigger sometimes attention and to focus on the prosecution, because it doesn't sound so serious. I even remember the recent article of William Shabazz, in which he was saying, you know, why can we talk even about genocide if we talk about only few thousand people, if this is really genocide, if you compare it to Holocaust? Are we now in the shadow of those crimes which were supposed to be prosecuted after World War II? And also, I think that we can see a strange direction in which we are going. For example, the states which were occupied, mainly I'm talking about Central Eastern Europe, during the Second World War II, they did believe mainly in national law. They believed that national law is much more well prepared for the prosecution of crimes than international one. The international is something unclear, we don't know what to expect from this. But then the Nuremberg Tribunal was established, then the international was developed. And now we can observe that, for example, if you look at the statements of the Ukrainian authorities, that Ukrainian authorities, they do believe, they do claim that they trust in international law. They would love to have international courts to be involved in the prosecution of those crimes, whether the whole world is saying, no, let's come back to national courts because they are more important. So do you see that this sometimes that our expectations, depending on what part of world we are talking about, are completely going into different direction? And also, I see some frustration because we can now hear even about the prosecution of very old guards or other workers of the concentration camps who were prosecuted, for example, in Germany, based now on the concept of joint criminal enterprise and so on. But when during the Second World War and after the end of the World War II, among others, the Polish government claimed all workers of the concentration camps should be treated as criminals and should be prosecuted. This was completely rejected by big powers and by UNWCC in general. And so the claims made by those states which I would say suffered to maybe to a greater extent, having in mind the number of victims, at that time were neglected, and this lesson was learned only many decades afterwards, that yes, everybody who took part in the organization of the concentration camp should be really prosecuted. And in the context of Ukraine, you were talking about this panic at certain moments, that Germany is losing a war, what would happen. But at the same time, we do remember that even at the moment when some military authorities were aware of bad military situation of Germany, still so many crimes were committed, yeah? And still extermination was ongoing. Do we have any lesson learned for the situation now in Ukraine? Because we want to see this, we want to send this signal to Russian authorities. We are going for you, we want to prosecute you, we are ready to do it. We established many cooperations. I can also see now that, like during the World War II, we have many different forums in which these issues are discussed. But do we know how to filter this panic to this extent that new crimes would not be committed because of those signals which we are sending towards the Russian authorities and also ordinary Russian people, because as you pointed out, we are talking about high-level criminals, but also low-level criminals. We are at this stage when we have proper norms to prosecute anyone who was involved in those crimes. This would be my main reflection, that we can see these differences in the perception of the law at certain moment, and there is a huge discussion, huge debate, development of legal norms, but at the very end the decision is taken by big powers, very minor amount, whom and for what we should prosecute, and only decades afterwards the lesson is learned by the whole world that maybe the actions undertaken were too limited, maybe at that time. So you can see that from that I do admire the work of the UNWCC, and I think that they made huge effort. There are huge achievements, and it's good that we talk a lot now. It's surprising that sometimes they went in their discussion much farther than we were few decades after the war. This is quite surprising. But at the same time, we can have these bitter feelings why this was at some moment wasted.
Wow. Fortunately, I don't have the responsibility, and I wouldn't want it anyway, to be able to comprehensively, accurately reply to everything that you've raised. But I'll give it my best effort. Okay. I think in the contemporary environment, the 800-pound gorilla in the corner of the room is Iraq. Now, I tried to get Tony Blair prosecuted in the British Parliament. We didn't get very far, but we had to go. And the vision of Gordon Brown, who was Deputy Prime Minister at the time of the Iraq invasion, calling for the indictment of Putin on a very restricted mandate, sticks in the throat of a great many people, not just in the West, but hugely undermines credibility internationally. And I think this is a huge problem for international law, and a reason to think about supporting Ukraine. Because any international process is subject to the Iraq problem, which is a huge one. And, there are technicalities. And, as legal scholars other than myself have pointed out, that some of those states, notably Canada, who worked their whatever off in order to weaken the provisions of crime against aggression in the ICC and to delay it, are now leading the call to try Putin for crimes of aggression. And this is not law. It is absolutely victor's justice, and pursuing that would be catastrophic for a sense of international law. And I think that is issue running through many of the issues that you raised. I don't think the scale is particularly significant. After all, the numbers of people involved in some of the African cases were not huge. And I think there's enough concern. Who knows, when we had the discussing this, when we had the conference in Berlin, there were powerful presentations about the abduction of children, and no one thought that anything would happen about that, but Mr. Khan in his wisdom decided to single out the abduction of children as the issue to go after Putin and his assistant. And at the very least, I think she's now concerned about what her holiday travel schedule will now look like. Northern Cyprus, perhaps, if she's lucky. So we can see progress, and the question comes back to, because you can't do it perfectly, do you not do anything? I think one looks to try to do the best one can, as the Commission did in very difficult circumstances. And by the way, lest we forget, they were doing this under Luftwaffe bomber and missile attack. My own mother, 6 weeks after Dresden, was blown up by a V2. You talk about going on to the end, you look in the archives and you see that people, Jews and others, are being murdered up to the last minute. There were also others, as we heard this morning, who were helping out, Polish slave workers, in their neighbour's garden. So this is not a question of all Russians, but it is a question of looking to, looking to change the power dynamic. You talked about large powers and small powers. Well, there was slight contradiction in your comment, because on the one hand, yes, what happened was the result of the agency of small countries. And for those IR scholars amongst us, the theory is only the great powers determine, but actually the smaller powers did determine a good deal. And the major powers from the Moscow conference on said, we will reserve to ourselves what happens to the leaders. But the others should be taken back to the countries where they committed their crimes and dealt with there, which is the UNWCC mandate, essentially. And as we've seen, those countries pursued and tried thousands, in all over Central and Western and Southern Europe. And the hearse, was detected by the British, captured by the British, and sent back to Poland. And the Poles tried a large number of concentration camp guards, and Oscar Groening is on the list, the final list from the Poles in 48, subsequent to the initial charge of 44. And the Poles, I think, probably tried more Auschwitz guards than others than any other country. But albeit, as the documentary shows, by and large, the Nazis got away with it. And by and large, probably the Russians will get away with it. But but if we end up with that lady only being able to take holidays in North Cyprus, and we get some thousands back, or all of the children, well, that might be something. If it means that she's rather more reluctant to kidnap any more, this also is something. I think the Ukrainians, perhaps wisely, have been soft-pedaling on announcing indictments and prosecutions because of retaliation, and this turning into prisoner swaps. But again, we'll finish now, because you raised, hopefully I've covered some of the ground you asked about. I think if there's one of the things I take away from all of this is we're confronted with arguments for realism and pragmatism, so-called. Well, if that frame of realism and pragmatism had prevailed, there never would have been Nuremberg, and never would have been any of these criminal justice systems. And then, is that a world better than the one we have now? And I don't think, when they pursued this, they didn't think that Pell would end up being appointed, let alone fired, and those dynamics. I think it is it isn't a spectator sport. And one has to see what one can do, the best one can do in the circumstances, with as much integrity as one can bring to it. And I think that's all I can say at the end of the day, because there aren't any pretty or easy or comprehensive solutions. although some of the legal scholars would like to convince us that there were. Does that help?
Yeah, it helps, but also I have another last question, because you did make such a good remark that we could see this mass movement, the flood of evidence, which was going to London, and London as the center of the discussion, which was, I think, quite comfortable situation to have all those who are interested there and discuss the evidence. And now I'm wondering, because in case of Ukraine, when still I see the proportions yet that we don't have such scale of crimes like we had during the World War II, but do you see now another problem, that there we had one center to discuss all of this and to collect, to document, and now we have so many different, we don't have centers, we have so many different places and discussions who should collect the evidence and whom we should trust with this flood of evidence. Because also we observe here in Poland that Ukrainians not necessarily trust even Polish authorities, because they are afraid that this war could be spread, that those testimonies could be given back to Russian authorities. And at that time, at that moment when you described, it was obvious choice, London. Now, if you would like to pick one center.
Well, I mean, there is The Hague, and there's also much easier communication in general. So, I don't think there are immediate comparisons. And yeah, trust, obviously, one had to trust whoever was the courier for the Home Army to get your message that you had expressed in Warsaw or in the ghetto to London. You talk about trust, that's a different level. But no, I don't think, fortunately, because of the INF Treaty, Putin doesn't have missiles to reach The Hague, or indeed to Lviv. But that's another story. But London was London, but also London was under missile attack.
Yeah.
They record this, how they had their meetings in bunkers when the building shook. And I think one of the accounts said, well, they just decided on the Anglo-American position that it was legal to bomb a city, even if it had defended, if it was of military value. And therefore the Nazis' attack on Britain was not illegal on the British cities, at which point the building blew up. Easy to laugh at now, but it was put with some merriment into the minutes of the time. So we should probably bring some other people in, but thank you so much for your very thoughtful questions.
Thank you for reading my mind there. That's exactly what I was thinking. I'm sure we've got some questions. We've got a couple of minutes for some questions. Anybody got any questions they want to give to either one of our guests? Or any interesting comments?
Professor Plescha, Professor Grzebyk, thank you both of you for so interesting lectures. I have a few remarks, maybe one or two questions. First remark, I'm truly grateful for your remark about the Harsh-Lauter Pact, for example. You talked about Gluck. This is one of the most important floor of the discussion about the justice during the Second World War. The discussion between the intellectualists, between the prominent professors, but most important, undoubtedly, and partly history of UNWCC is a measure of worthy of importance of political leadership and contribution by the countries. And as we talking during all this day, we saw so many interesting presentations about the materials. And in my opinion, it's very important to one more said that Polish government on exile starts not only technically, but it was systematically work over collect of evidence through the whole war. It was some bypass, some way around the discussion between superpowers. And the beginning was undoubtedly just after a few weeks of 1939, but in 1941, Polish Prime Minister make a special order, and they start to collect these names and these crimes, thousands. And this is the result, the first part of the contribution of the materials to the UNWCC to end of 1944. But undoubtedly, when we're thinking about the justice and about the prosecution of the crimes during the Second World War, in my opinion, we can separate three periods, and partly it's connecting to it UNWCC, because during the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we have all the time same answer to the prime ministers, including Sikorski, after any try of looking for some actions. Usually it's answer retribution through victory. And this is delay. This is all the time the delay of the answer. Then in August 1944, Morgenthau started the discussion together with Stimson, two very influent undersecretaries of U.S. government, and we have a short time of wage, because Morgenthau, after his experience in Europe during the visits in American-controlled territory, after the invitation of Dwight Eisenhower, was sure that it had to be moved on. And we have some discussion. We have a final stage of develop of UNWCC, and finally, after and during the beginning of presidency of Truman, we have a first action, but it's a little late. I mean, it's the end of the war. And as you said about the delegation for Jackson to the Nuremberg, it's very important, but it's very important to remember how looks like a discussion in Washington in this time between Jackson and Harlan Stone as a president of Supreme Court. And this is finally a question to both of you about some bravery to make some decision and looking for some solution, legal solution, during the hard period. And undoubtedly, Second World War was open question about the mechanism of justice after the Second World War. Partly, some of domestic tribunals found own way. We have a own history of domestic tribunals in Poland also. But right now, as Patrycja Grzebyk said, is also the question about the looking some of the solution for the situation in Ukraine, and this is the short remark and short question to both of you.
Shorter. I wouldn't want to be around for your long question.
It's finally is the question how to do that. How to do that? It's open question about the new tribunal.
Please.
I think your account of FDR, as I've indicated, I don't think it's an accurate one. I think FDR was isolated from his administration, particularly from the State Department, but he sent Pell You know, they got some money, but you know, the administration, the bureaucracy, refused to create a national office for the OWCC until late 1944. And then they did it with, you know, lots of aplomb and lots of maps and pins and IBM computers, IBM filing systems. But every other country had had a national office, including the British, from end of 1943, beginning of 1944. They were waited almost a year. And your account of Morgenthau and so on is missing the one word Pell. You know, when, as Pell accounts, when he met Morgenthau, Morgenthau thought that everything was going full steam ahead. And it was Pell's briefing to Morgenthau that put a bomb up him, and you've got the War Refugees Board and everything else happening after Morgenthau gets back to Washington. Similarly, as I've said already, without Pell's fuss in the winter of '44, I don't think we would have had Jackson going, I don't think you'd have had Nuremberg. It would all just have been allowed to fizzle out for realist reasons whatsoever. I also think with respect to Poland and Roosevelt, yes, you know, major powers, minor powers, but Roosevelt never forgave the Polish government for annexing a piece of Czechoslovakia immediately before the war. He said something at the time about, I don't know, picking the pocket of a man who's just been mugged, I can't remember, but words to that effect in a statement in the summer of '39. And I think that was a major Polish mistake, and the American president didn't forget it in terms of things that happened subsequently about what the Poles would get up to, as it were, you know, if they were allowed to revert. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, there are many other things that happened, of course, but I think he noticed.
Yeah, so the principle of clean hands, yeah, sometimes helps, yeah, and you also did mention that now within this discussion, sometimes maybe it's good to know where to sit a little bit behind. Like you said that, you know, the initiative of Blair and other British lawyers was not well perceived, having in mind Iraq in 2003. In which we also, as Poland, participated, yeah. So we don't have clean hands in it as well, yeah. And but that's why I think that maybe sometimes it's not the question of good idea, but also who is presenting this idea, and to find a really credible credible representatives who can present idea to the whole world, because we know today, I think that now we are at this stage in international law, that we know that we can achieve a lot even without big powers, because the ICC, the Hague about which you were talking about, this is the treaty in which there is no US, no Russia, no China, and still it can function. Yeah? And so we are able to establish institutions without big powers. And even if everybody was complaining in the media, Security Council is blocked, we would have veto of Russia, fine. So let's go to General Assembly, and at least in General Assembly we can have a clear statement that aggression was committed. So, but the problem now, which we would love to have, is we would love to have General Assembly to give approval to establish another tribunal, hybrid or special. Let's not go into the details. But how to convince the whole world that the problem of Ukraine is really a problem of the whole world and not only of the region. And this is because we don't have clean hands, as the world remembers about Iraq, remembers about decades in Afghanistan, about other interventions in which also European states, including Poland, participated. They do complain about selectivity, yeah, and selectiveness of justice. And this is something, I think that I loved your remarks about the question of immunity and that the history which we have behind us, yeah, that maybe we should come back to the question of Hitler, if there are so many comparisons between Putin and Hitler, yeah, about which, you know, these examples of discussion about which we've forgotten, even ICJ forgotten, as you reminded, yeah? But that's why maybe these discussions need to go on step by step, judgment after judgment, I do not reject the idea that maybe in the next judgment before the ICJ would change his mind about the immunity and international crimes. Also having in mind, because we are so focused now on criminal justice, but please don't forget, like it was during the World War II, that simultaneously there are other forums, like for example in the International Law Commission, not in reference to the war in Ukraine, there were discussions about immunities. And they were also questioned, should immunity cover aggression or not? And as far as I believe, as far as I remember, this was Poland who said, please add aggression, because it was not there in 2022. Please add aggression.
We've gone a little bit over time. I apologize for that. I'm assuming we have no more questions. We have no more questions. I know that Dan wanted just to show 1 more minute. Do you still? No? No? Okay. Right. So I want to thank everybody for joining us very much. And thank you very much to our distinguished guests for joining us. And that is the end of our workshop day. So thank you so much.